Imagine waking up on a cold, muddy morning in a crumbling wooden hut. There's no breakfast sizzling, no coffee brewing, no warm oven. Just hunger gnawing at your belly. Again, for millions of medieval peasants, this was life. A daily battle not for riches, but for calories. And what they ate to survive? It was cheap, strange, and sometimes downright revolting. In this journey, we'll uncover the 15 cheapest meals that kept medieval peasants alive. But be warned, this isn't a tale of feasting. It's a grim exploration of how people cheated starvation with whatever the land, the seasons, or sheer desperation allowed. Let's begin with pottage, the ultimate peasant staple. Thick, mushy, and endlessly variable. It was a boiling mix of grains, water, and whatever could be thrown in. Onions, nettles, wild herbs, or even yesterday's stale bread. Meat, rarely, unless it was a bone boiled to exhaustion or a lucky rat. Then came barley bread, coarse, dark, and heavy. Wheat was for the rich, peasants baked with barley, rye, or even acorns when times were bad. It was filling but harsh on the gut and teeth, yet it lined the stomach and gave just enough strength to face another day in the fields. Gruel was the poor man's porridge, a thin mixture of water and oats or millet, boiled over smoky fires in soot-blackened pots. Sometimes sweetened with foraged berries or thickened with peas, it was served morning and night, again and again. In desperate times, they turned to tree bark, dandelion roots, and boiled grass. Survival wasn't about taste. It was about not dying. One surprisingly common ingredient? Turnips. Before potatoes came to Europe, turnips were the go-to root. Mashed, roasted, or mixed into pottage, they were cheap, plentiful, and could grow in harsh soil. Still, many peasants loathed them. A meal of nothing but turnips meant hard times. And if you were lucky, very lucky, maybe once a week, there was salted fish. Dried herring or pickled eel brought from distant coasts, traded and preserved through months of winter. The salt was precious. The protein, life-saving. What's striking is not just the poverty, but the creativity. Peasants made food out of things we wouldn't call food today. They fermented weeds, dried snails, made broth from chicken feet, and collected bird eggs from the forest floor. These meals weren't appetizing, but they kept a body going. In the next chapter, we'll dive into how feasts of the lords contrasted this harsh reality, and how sometimes the scraps from a noble's table could change a villager's week. And so, as the fire crackled in the muddy corners of the hut, life carried on. Let's turn to medieval England, a land not of kings and knights, but of those who toiled in the shadow of castles. For most villagers, meat was a distant dream. Their sustenance came from pottage, a thick, soupy stew of whatever was available. Turnips, onions, wild herbs, beans soaked overnight, perhaps a sprinkle of barley if the harvest had been kind. It simmered over open fires for hours, day after day, growing thicker, sourer, darker. Families would eat from the same pot for a week. They even had a saying, "The best pottage is the oldest one." When there was bread, it was coarse and dark. Rye and barley mixed with ground beans or even acorns during the worst seasons. Sometimes, to stretch the flour, they added ground tree bark. The bread filled the belly but left a bitter memory on the tongue. In the winter, food became strategy. They dried nettles, wild spinach, and thistles in the sun, and stored them like treasure. One wrong winter, one failed crop, and a whole village could face hunger. Children gnawed on roasted roots. Women walked miles to find a few berries, or boil moss scraped from rocks to make broth. And yet, in their hardship, there was creativity. In France, peasants made soup à la pierre, literally stone soup. The story goes that a traveler once asked for food but was denied, so he began boiling a stone in water. Curious villagers gathered, each adding a small ingredient: a carrot, a bone, some garlic. By the end, the pot was full. The stone? Still there, but the lesson lived on. Peasants told the tale as a reminder: when everyone gives a little, all can eat. In the Loire Valley, they foraged mushrooms from the forest, the safe kinds passed down through generations. These were fried on flat stones, or dried and used to flavor thin broths. Eggs were precious, often traded for salt. Milk, if available, came mostly from goats, and was turned into soft sour cheese wrapped in cloth and stored underground. And in the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, they made grütze, a grain porridge of oats, millet, and whatever berries could be mashed in. Thick, chewy, with a sour bite from fermented milk, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In every corner of Europe, the poor survived not by abundance, but by ingenuity. They boiled bones for days. They fermented roots. They pickled anything that could be pickled. They shared ovens, stored salt in communal barrels, and passed down recipes as survival codes, whispered from mother to daughter. But some foods, no matter how meager, became tradition. Ritual. Pride, a dish remembered by a child's hunger, but also by the warmth of their mother's voice saying, "Eat, it's all we have." And somehow, it was enough. As we move into the mountain valleys of what is now Switzerland and northern Italy, the struggle for survival grows even steeper. Here the cold bites harder, the soil is thin, and the window for harvest is narrow. And yet, even amid icy winds and rocky slopes, medieval peasants carved out a way to feed their families with what little nature gave them. In highland villages, one of the most cherished staples was barley broth. Barley was a hardy grain, able to withstand the colder alpine climates. It was soaked, boiled for hours in large blackened pots, and flavored with anything available: onion peels, crushed wild garlic, maybe a bone left over from a slaughter months ago. The result was a thick, smoky porridge that stuck to the ribs and kept laborers warm through biting winters. Another peasant favorite was cheese ends and rye bread. Cows and goats grazed in the high pastures during summer, and their milk was carefully turned into hard cheeses. The best wheels were sold to towns or monasteries. Peasants were left with the cracked edges, moldy rinds, or slivers that broke off in storage. These were scraped clean, softened with hot water, and eaten with stale rye bread baked weeks earlier in shared village ovens. In colder months, sauerkraut and turnip mash became essential. Cabbage, once harvested, was salted and packed into barrels, a fermented treasure that lasted all winter. Turnips were boiled and mashed with a bit of lard or goat's milk if one was lucky. It was not a feast, but it kept the belly from aching. In alpine communities, dandelion roots were dug up in the fall, roasted black, and ground into a sort of bitter coffee. No caffeine, of course, but the warmth of a hot drink offered a psychological comfort that mattered just as much. Pine needle tea was also common, not for flavor, but to ward off scurvy. Rich in vitamin C, peasants steeped fresh needles in boiling water and drank it as medicine more than refreshment. In the evenings, entire families would huddle around a fire, eating from shared wooden bowls, dipping torn bits of bread into the same pot. Conversations were few, mouths were busy, and daylight was short. But in these simple meals, there was resilience, tradition, and an intimate knowledge of the land passed down through generations. These weren't recipes born of luxury. They were born of necessity, of survival, and of a people who learned to read the forest and soil like scripture. Along the stormy coasts of medieval France, England, and the Low Countries, life had a taste of salt. Not from luxury, but from necessity. The sea was a source of both nourishment and danger. Peasants here relied on its tides, its winds, and the uncertain catch of each new dawn. Dried herring became a cornerstone of coastal diets. Cheap, plentiful during spawning seasons, and easy to preserve with salt, it was the poor man's meat. Families would gut and dry hundreds of fish during the summer, stringing them from rooftops or storing them in barrels. The result was a chewy, intensely salty meal that could last for months. Often eaten cold or briefly warmed over fire, it was served with rough black bread and a mug of weak ale. Sometimes, the only thing available was fish bones and skin, leftovers from larger catches taken by merchants or lords. Peasants boiled these remnants into fish broth, a thin but warming liquid, often thickened with oats or crushed peas. Seaweed was not just flotsam to the medieval coastal peasant. It was food. Bladderwrack and dulse were collected, rinsed, and boiled. Though bitter, they were filling and rich in nutrients. Children were sometimes fed seaweed mash sweetened with spoiled milk or bits of fruit rind. A crude dessert born of survival. In villages farther inland, but still within reach of tidal estuaries, cockles and mussels were gathered by hand. Old women and children combed the muddy flats with baskets, picking shellfish by feel. Once boiled, they were eaten with wild herbs, or ground into a paste and spread on bread. There was always risk. Bad shellfish could kill. But hunger rarely allowed caution. Spoiled butter and rancid lard were unfortunate realities. Without refrigeration, fats spoiled quickly. Rather than waste them, peasants mixed them into porridge or stews to mask the flavor. There were even tricks passed from elder to child, like burning nettle or mixing in vinegar, to disguise the smell and taste. Winter was hardest. Fishing boats could not launch. Storms battered the coasts. The last barrels of dried herring were guarded carefully. Some families turned to rat traps and bird snares, cooked with onions if available. Gull eggs, stolen from high cliffs, were eaten raw or baked into barley cakes. And yet, among all this struggle, there were fleeting joys. The return of the herring shoals, the rare days of calm seas, the warmth of shared fish stew on a cold night. The sea could be cruel, but it was also constant, and in that there was a strange comfort. In the famine years, when crops failed, livestock perished, and hope thinned like a winter's soup, medieval peasants across Western Europe turned to foods that tested the very limits of endurance and dignity. These were not meals, they were acts of survival. One of the most desperate meals was known in some parts of England as bark bread. When flour was gone and the grain stores emptied, peasants scraped the inner bark from trees, often birch or pine, dried it, ground it into powder, and mixed it with whatever scraps of barley or rye they had. The resulting bread was bitter, difficult to digest, and dangerously fibrous, but it filled the stomach. In the darkest winters, straw and hay were boiled in water until softened and then thickened with clytie or ash. Sometimes they were mixed with ground bones or animal hoof shavings. These concoctions could hardly be called food, yet people consumed them, chewing slowly, praying for spring. There are records, whispered, not written, of peasants who boiled leather, shoes, belts, harnesses, soaked, scraped, and boiled again to make them soft enough to eat. The taste was putrid, the texture like rope, but to throw it away was unthinkable. Cats and dogs, once companions, were eaten when even the rats disappeared. Some villages made secret pacts, one animal per week, shared among several families. The meat was tough and stringy, but nourishing. Bones were boiled until they crumbled, then added to porridge for extra bulk. Children, especially, suffered. Mothers created hunger cakes, mixtures of crushed acorns, dried nettle leaves, bits of moss, and anything that could be pressed into a shape. Baked on hot stones, they looked like bread, but tasted of forest and bitterness. Still, children would clutch them tightly, savoring every bite. During long sieges or especially cruel winters, there are tales of graveyard stew, not always metaphorical. Though rare and taboo, some peasants exhumed old bones to boil, scraping marrow, seeking any remaining nutrition. This was not crime. This was starvation. And yet, amid all this horror, community persisted. Villages gathered together. Those with even a little shared it. Stories were told to distract children from hunger. Songs were sung. Herbalists worked magic with dandelions and thistle. Faith, somehow, endured. By spring, wild garlic and sorrel sprouted, signaling the end of another brutal cycle. New bread was baked. Livestock gave birth. The living honored the lost and moved forward, not in triumph, but in quiet defiance of nature's cruelty. This was the real feast of the medieval peasant. Not food, but survival.